Thank you for joining us here today. I want to start just a brief introduction. So, like it or not, banks are pivotal to rolling out societal change and influencing how we operate in the world. When a terrorist attacks one of our buildings in our country, the bank puts in regulations and tries to track down how that money moved around, and how did that possibly happen, and we help with law enforcement on that. When a country invades one of our allies or one of our own countries, similarly, we block them out of the financial system when we rule that out. I don't think that the approach to ESG is all that different, but for me at least, it does feel that way. It's a lot more personal. It impacts our future, it impacts our kids, it impacts the people we work with, and I think that we have this critical role as bankers, as technology companies in the banking industry, to try and help affect some really important critical change that's going to change the direction of our life here. My name is Chris Burtch. I work at Standard Chartered Bank in New York. I'm responsible for correspondent banking for the Americas, for North and South America. And I'm honored to be here to moderate the first panel discussion for BAFT today, where we will explore the challenges facing banks for ESG and the opportunities that exist within the technology space to bring this to reality. I'm joined today by Ian Laverty, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at TradeSun. In December of just this past December, TradeSun acquired Coriolis, the world's first fully automated ESG assessment platform. The platform's been developed in collaboration with 70 international banks, trade bodies, associations, and government organizations, and today maps 480 million companies globally against recognized regulatory frameworks and standards, including the UN Sustainable Development Goals, EU Taxonomy, and SASB. I'm joined immediately to my left by Marissa Adams, who is the North American Head of Global Trade and Receivables Finance at HSBC. Within the context of ESG, Marissa is focused on ensuring that trade finance supports the ESG ambitions of companies of all sizes and promoting the democratization of trade finance for the benefit of all members in the global supply chain. And then, last but not least, Erik Kiaer, who is an innovator with 30 years of experience advising companies on how to grow and generate economic value. Today, he consults on ESG strategy at Deloitte, where he is a reputable transformation leader within the financial services industry. We're going to start off today with a poll just to get a bit of audience engagement. So we'll put the first poll up. We're looking here at what are the biggest concerns in rolling out ESG initiatives in your own organizations. You can see, it should be coming up.
I think on the Slido.
Sorry?
It's on Slido as well.
Yeah. There we go. So there's the options. You don't know where to start. There's no short-term gain. You're not sure about the short-term gains versus the long-term gains. Is it a field of dreams issue? If we build this, is it actually going to pay off? Is it going to work? We've seen this with other things in the past. You don't know where to start, or is there something else altogether? And maybe while the polls are coming in, maybe if I could ask the panel, Marissa, do you want to start in terms of what your thoughts are around that space in terms of what are the biggest concerns in rollout?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Chris. So I think one of the things that we certainly see with our clients is, I think it's less about the short-term economic benefits, which I see obviously is being voted up there, but where to start. As we've seen with sort of larger corporates, with large teams who have a transition pathway, there's a lot more tangible benefits. They're owning the space, they're able to provide benefits through their supply chain. But where we actually see some of the biggest concern is that if you look at, and Todd referenced earlier the $1.8 trillion trade gap, is that the core of ESG is in those smaller suppliers and down the supply chain, and how we actually provide that financing, but also give them a path in. So that's where I think that we certainly are seeing some of the biggest challenges in ESG, and actually where we see the role of financial institutions such as ourselves and many others in the room, both being able to support them in terms of guidance, not just financing, because I think it's such a minefield when you get started, but also connecting them to other organizations, even consultants such as Deloitte, in order to see how they can really work through and see those benefits long term, but with perhaps less investment to start with, which is a challenge for some smaller organizations.
Ian, if you look at some of the answers that are up here on the board, fear of greenwashing seems to be putting out at paramount with some of the things that you guys have at TradeSun, the models that are there, and your other thoughts around the industry. Is this surprising to you?
Not particularly, no. I think the top two answers there, fear of greenwashing and lack of tangible short-term economic benefit, they're certainly the two most common bits of feedback that we get. As you mentioned, Chris, we've worked with around 70 banks across the world to develop a methodology, an assessment methodology for ESG. One of the biggest challenges around encouraging implementation from those banks is trying to second-guess regulators. And at the moment, most banks, I think, see this as a cost and an overhead and a compliance or a risk requirement, if you like. And I think that's muddied by the fact that there are so many different regulatory bodies all implementing bits of ESG assessment in different fields of our industry. Then that's exacerbated by the fact that each country or region or territory is developing its own regulatory framework as well. So I think one of the things that's not necessarily on that poll, but coming up in a later one, is that lack of clarity from regulators, which means in terms of that short-term economic benefit, it'd be very easy to implement something and then find out it doesn't match the regulatory requirements, and then you have to undo that and undo the processes. So I think there's a real need for regulators to sit down with banks and actually work out what monitoring and assessment looks like.
Okay. Moving into just the general concept of ESG, the E gets a lot of airtime. It's where the majority of regulatory guidance and data is concentrated, but all three are intrinsically linked. And as we were talking about this panel before we came on, there's like a good environmental policy requires good governance. A carbon credit program can also have positive or negative social impacts for a community. It could, if you're getting out of a certain carbon producing area, you could have an employment impact in other areas. Maybe Erik, if we can start with you, how do you think that each of the banks here should be thinking about balancing the importance of the three aspects of ESG?
Well, I think a sustainable organization understands the importance of each of those three to their strategy. I think too often you see an ESG strategy as something that's over there and it's not linked to the corporate strategy. And to the degree that you can build in each of those three pieces of a reporting framework, right, into the strategy, that is what can help you actually become sustainable. And we talked earlier this session on the importance to talent. We see that what causes people to actually want to work with you is how you build that. So just another example of, I think, the interconnectedness between all of those three.
Very good. In terms of, like, I think E gets a lot of the limelight. The S, the social aspect, certainly gets a lot of things, and both of those two are like extremely tangible and fairly concrete. The G, oftentimes people don't even remember what it is. From a banker, like, we know that G is critical, it's core to everything that we run these days. What are your thoughts around providing good governance programs and having an established, a really solid G pillar within the ESG framework?
Yeah, and I think, as institutions, I think, and certainly if I speak for HSBC, we have established, a net zero policy. We have extremely strong governance around it. But one of the things I think that as institutions we're challenged with is that a lot of this is manual. So at this stage, we're working through governance across obviously multiple geographies. And I think to that point that you mentioned on regulation, everything's changing quite a lot. So you're constantly having to react to, with best intents, how are we tracking both our own but also our clients' ESG ambitions in a way that is both transparent but also in the spirit of the regulation and the law. Because I think that there's a lot that can happen where you start to track things because you're trying to hit a target or a metric rather than actually trying to improve things across the board. So one of the things that we're certainly seeing is how do we use technology more within that, and both working with external and internal providers. But I also think there's a piece here around, as we start to kind of reimagine ESG, to your point, environmental is quite, I wouldn't want to say easy, but it's much more straightforward to measure it. Where we're starting to sort of really think is how do we measure the social impact? So we have a number of clients that we support in social programs where supply chain finance in particular, where it's providing finance to underserved communities and minorities throughout the world. But there's less guidance around it. So one thing that we're sort of thinking about is how do we continue to provide that excellent governance, but also not be afraid to sort of take a step that may or may not be quite there yet from a regulatory perspective, but will help a client and ultimately will help enable both trade finance and payments and to suppliers that we might not, because we're treading on that governance piece as well.
It's one of those things where I think we have to recognize we're all learning. We need to learn really fast. And there's a Leonard Cohen song that has, there's a crack in everything, and that's where the light comes in. And from a regulatory perspective, just to make sure it's light and not water coming in. But I think that's an important part, that there's a false precision often in terms of what we measure, how we do it, and how we govern it. We're really learning, and that's important.
I think that's, and to your point, Marissa, as well, and I think you're right. I wouldn't be scared of saying that the environmental side is easier to measure. It's much easier to quantify, I think is how I would clarify that. You know, you can measure carbon emissions, and there's regulation around that. You can measure energy consumption. You know, you can measure carbon offsetting, for example. Whereas a lot of the components of the S and the G are more qualitative, and they're policy and they're procedure based, and that's difficult to measure. It's almost a yes or a no type answer. But I think one of the interesting things is the E part is very prominent at the moment, but I think that's because a lot of the regulation there is new, and it's certainly very topical. And you have things like Paris climate, you've got the COP summits, etc. It's very now, it's very topical. I think it's easy to forget that the S and the G element, actually, we've been doing that as an industry for quite a while. You know, so if you look at anti-money laundering, if you look at anti-slave labor, if you look at fair pay, gender equality, things like that, if you look at sanctions checking, there's a lot of stuff that we do already under the label of S and G. It's just not been put into a framework like that. And I think what we're now doing is we're putting that into one framework, which actually the G part is the governance of all of that. You know, good environmental practice is good governance. Good social contribution, social policies is good governance, if you like. So I think the focus is on the E because it's the new part and it's easy to quantify, whereas the S and the G, I think we've been doing that or certain elements for quite a while. I think we're now just putting frameworks around that and calling it something different.
Okay. How do we think in the context of digitalization? Banks around the world are upgrading payments platforms, trade platforms, trying to accommodate to be faster, nimbler, more transparent to our underlying clients. And doing that requires an enormous amount of time, resources, labor, investment dollars. And you're doing that at a time the banks are doing that at a time where all of this is also changing on the side. And you guys have talked about sort of that moving bogey around different governance regimes, not only like changes within one regime, but also changes across regimes or differences across regimes. How do you build or architect systems to be resilient and nimble enough to go and incorporate these changes along the way? Marissa, can we start with you?
Yeah, well, I actually think that what we've built around anti-money laundering is something that actually can be used a lot for ESG. Because if you think about it, we've created systems, networks where we can trace funds, we can know your customer. So we know a lot actually from that perspective. There's no reason why you can't layer on some of those ESG categories into the existing systems that we already have. But there are still some gaps, and I think that that's at the top level. So one of the things, and it's quite fortuitous, we were discussing a little bit earlier about deep tier supply chains, is that that's where the difference really starts to happen. So we have a lot of information at the top couple, 2-3 levels, but the further you go down supply chains is where actually probably the most ESG impact is felt, but we have less information. So being able to build that down, but I do think leveraging what we have. Equally, I think to your point, investment has to happen. So without that investment, and I use the term, we sort of bootstrap a lot today around ESG reporting, and it's done well, but without that data and without those systems that can really share information across the board, we won't get to the ultimate outcomes that we want to get to.
Very good. I think that's absolutely right, and to look at the system that we've developed with the banks, it is that reliance on data that drives it, because we're all trying to second guess the regulatory frameworks at the moment and what we're going to have to assess and how. is that tinnitus or is that? It's that data that drives that change, if you like. And if the process is automated and it's digitized so far as possible, that gives you that flexibility and fleet of foot, if you like, to change and to adapt to those changing regulations.
So I'm working with a client now developing a sustainability-linked loan, and in sort of running that through the system, you find a lot of digital post-it notes that need to fit everywhere, right? There's like, oh, this one has this KPI, and I think it's easy to fall into the trap that you have to build a system for the scale that we have in our operations right now. A lot of these new, certainly products and services are going to be small, and we actually need to, again, learn faster than our competitors, build capabilities, and then be able to move that towards how it improves your margin. But you don't have to, it's an innovation game in many ways. It's about trying new things and moving it forward.
Do you guys think, you guys, several of you mentioned investment that's required in order to go and make all this happen. From my point of view, there seems to still be a lack of incentive, concrete, tangible incentive from regulators, whether it's capital relief on green loans or other financial incentives that could probably help drive development, which we see on the technology side. We see subsidies happening within the solar space in order to improve the technology within solar. Is the industry or the regulators, the industry at large, including the regulators, doing enough to try and incentivize the right behavior today? Is there more we should be doing? And is there any calls to action that you guys would advise?
Yes, I'll take that one first, Chris. I've already made the point that I think regulators, globally, regulators need to have more collaboration with each other, as well as collaboration with the industry. And the first question up there actually leads to this point as well in terms of who should be leading the ESG initiative in countries. And I don't think it's one party. I don't think it's regulators. I don't think it's banks. I don't think it's corporates. I think it should be a collaboration of all of those. But what we see happening already is what we see with the implementation of so much legislation. It's difficult for governments and regulators to regulate millions of businesses in a country. To take Marissa's point, the real driver of ESG are those SMEs, if you like. And assessing SMEs is difficult for most banks. And again, data-driven models and technology will support that, but that is the real challenge. What you see is governments imposing regulation and legislation on banks and asking banks to monitor their clients. So the regulators are regulating a small number of banks, regulating millions and millions of customers. So the onus will be on the banks and the responsibility will be on the banks to work with their clients. I think that's one of the big challenges. I think a second challenge in all of this is those regulators speaking to each other. And if you are in international trade and you're providing trade finance or supply chain finance, and you're working with a corporate that's importing from another jurisdiction or another territory, what you find is that company has to comply with whatever regulatory framework exists in its own country or its own territory. But if it's importing goods from another territory, say the EU or Australia or Asia into the US, for example, you also have to ensure that the products comply with the regulations there as well. And that's really difficult for banks to take on that responsibility, because what you're essentially asking banks to do is become experts in regulation in every jurisdiction around the world. And that's an impossible task.
I think there are times too where the confusion and challenges around regulation overshadow the opportunities that are out there. There are, I mean, you know, William Gibson said the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And that's, I think, the case where you have certain transition risks are there because there's huge transition opportunities, whether that's in power and utilities or energy transition or food and agriculture, are areas that I think are sort of driving some of the tangible proof for why this is actually a great opportunity that can actually bring, to your point, everyone to the table and have conversations about something concrete, and rather than talking in the abstract about we might need to regulate this. We have something really tangible.
Well, and I would add to Erik's point, and to answer your question, is that yes, obviously the regulators need to play a key role, but as institutions, we have moved society and our businesses along with us. So if we think about KYC, that was something where we inherently changed the dynamic of who could and couldn't use our payment systems and our rails. The way that I look at it from an ESG perspective is it's not an either or, and I've seen a few of the questions that have come up, and I think about transition. So I believe it's our role as institutions to support our customers to transition to these things, and I think the more that we can do that as an imperative, and of course, there has to be we are financial institutions that are profit-based, so there has to be something around that, but fundamentally, that ability for us, and I think the leadership role we take, one, I don't think there's anybody else out there doing it. So when we speak to treasurers, to CFOs, they come to us, as I'm sure to other banks in this room, for advice because we do know more than perhaps other types of institutions or advisors. So I see that role in transition is something that's incredibly important versus trying to get to a nirvana of ESG, but actually supporting everyone to move through.
There's a question on here it looks like it's from Nick, on how to build ESG into payment products, which is interesting. I think ESG on trade is perhaps a little bit more tangible and concrete, but on the payment side, curious to hear thoughts on, are the green deposits realistic? There are incentivization schemes, discounted pricing on payments that are related to green, things that support green or environmental or social aspects?
There are, you can incentivize things and loans, et cetera. It's still tricky on the KPIs and how you do it, but specifically on payments, you have to sort of understand the human behavior of it. When it's like really at the point of purchase payment, it's sometimes hard to get people to pay for something that's green. But if you get the mass, you can actually make a difference. I think it's emerging. I don't think it's been settled yet, and the models aren't necessarily quite cooked, but again, learn.
I think it's an area where the regulators have taken an interesting view as well, and one of the things that we've seen in the EU is the EU coming out with a statement suggesting that they're going to take a negative view on preferential terms for good ESG performance, because their opinion is that it's likely to encourage greenwashing and misreporting if there is some kind of incentive for positive reporting or making a positive contribution. So that's thrown a bit of a spanner in the works in terms of a lot of the models that we've seen that banks are looking to introduce. And it's back to that point in one of your earlier questions, Chris, around incentivizing. How do you incentivize the take-up of good ESG practice? Already the regulator's saying, actually, this shouldn't be something that's incentive-driven. This is just something that you should be doing out of good governance and good corporate social responsibility.
There's some interesting happenings, though, if you look at, there's all the controversy around carbon offsets and things like that. But you're starting to see now within value chains, say you're a beef producer, you want to reduce the methane and the footprint of cows. Well, that's diet related. That means you need to get a specific digester to create food, but that then reduces that carbon or footprint by a lot. And you can actually use that offset, that credit, to inset into your value chain. There's a lot of talk about prices on offsets. Well, insets are twice as high at this point because there's you can link it to something specific in your value chain. And it gets back to an earlier point around transparency. That's why you have to build transparency into all of these systems so you can track things. You can understand that there is, the greenwashing was number one in our fears. Transparency has to be built in.
Okay. If we could put up the second poll, which is around the biggest challenges for your institutions progressing towards making impactful progress on ESG initiatives, whether it's lack of senior sponsorship, demand from clients, capital relief from regulators, lack of clarity. While the audience is polling in on this, are there any particular risks or opportunities TB professionals, transaction banking professionals, should really be thinking about front and center as they sort of try to tackle this internally?
Happy to answer that. So I think the first one, and I'm going to riff on a few of the questions that had come through before, is it's not an all or nothing. discussion. So the first thing I'd say from our perspective that we've seen is that, one, there's so much information out there that this is a huge educational lift for our salespeople, for our product people, for our service people to understand. And I think that that's something where we've certainly rolled out myriads of training, but it's only when it's sort of real with the conversation with the client in the room. So I think one of the biggest challenges we have is equipping our teams to have these conversations in a way that's meaningful both for clients, but also for regulators in the industry. So that would be sort of one from our perspective. Two, it's that element of, and I will go back again to transition. So different companies are on very different stages of their transition plans. And I think one of the things from a transaction banking perspective is understanding where each of those clients is and what is that tailored solution. And that takes a lot of manpower. So I think one of the interesting things around this isn't necessarily, we're moving towards a digital, as much as possible, digital trade, digital solutions for our clients. But actually, in many ways, I see this as an opportunity for transaction bankers to, one, have a new skill set, but also to ask more consultative questions to their clients that perhaps in a more commoditized environment we were losing. So in many ways, an opportunity on that side.
Okay.
I kind of feel I've led the audience a little bit with some of my earlier comments when you look at the results there. But it's not. It's not a big surprise, and it's the feedback that we get more than anything else, I think, from banks. But just following up on Marissa's point, and it corresponds with B there, the second most popular answer, which is the demand from clients. I think that's absolutely right, because businesses don't understand what they need to report on. Certainly the SMEs, which are the bulk of businesses, as we know. For the large multinational corporates, many of them are regulated already. Those that aren't regulated, and even before they were regulated, they've been reporting on environmental impact and environmental initiatives, good governance, as part of their annual reports every single year. This is something that's brand new for SMEs. And one of the things that we've been actively engaged in is working with banks to help to educate the SMEs that they deal with, and not just their corporate banking clients, but particularly with things like supply chain finance, where you're working with a large client who may have hundreds or potentially thousands of suppliers in that supply network. And to your point, Marissa, assessing all of those companies and working with all of those companies, that's a lot of manpower, or people power. There's a lot of administration burden in most of the typical ESG assessment methodology. And the more we can digitize that and the more we can use data to drive that, the more we make that process efficient and less burdensome for clients as well. And then not so much the lack of demand from clients, but actually the perceived administration burden of reporting on ESG, I think, is one of the bigger barriers for uptake.
You talked about the digitization there, and in terms of, and I like the second question here around large IT budgets, which are often a struggle for regional banks. And shouldn't there be more of a focus on democratization of these capabilities? Marissa, you also talked about how we could leverage our AML framework, and this could be just another feature that we add in through this. Is the IT spend as daunting as it seems when you're first starting out, or is there the possibility to leverage existing infrastructure?
Yeah, so, again, I have a vested interest in this answer, so I'll put my hands up straight away. But the IT spend on this, if it's digitized properly and it uses data aggregation and automation, actually shouldn't be that expensive. And the way we see it being implemented with the banks that we work with is very much just another risk rating methodology. So in the same way that they'll take credit risk reporting, they'll take financial risk reporting, we find that they're using data to assess against ESG frameworks and standards, and they're using that as another set of risk data. So when they're working with a large client and looking at their entire supply network, if you're using a process that's heavy administration burden that requires businesses to complete surveys and questionnaires and responses, you're passing administration burden onto all of those suppliers. It also then has to come back, and an analyst has to sit and analyze all of those responses and then make a subjective assessment as to how that organization has performed against ESG metrics. If you want to do that and make it cost effective, you need to automate that as much as possible. So rather than having 100 analysts looking at survey responses, etc., if you can use a data-driven process that aggregates the data, collects the data for you, and has that concordance to map against regulatory frameworks, actually you take both the administration burden and time out of it, but also quite a lot of the cost out of the process as well. So it doesn't need to be an expensive IT implementation, and actually shouldn't be.
I think when SOX compliance happened early in the 2000s, you had to add a bunch of things. I think we know how to do this, and I agree that it doesn't have to be this huge burden that you have to add. But I think it's easy in these systems to lose the forest for the trees. And what the opportunity is now is trying to figure out through analytics, through AI, et cetera, to start to see what are the correlations between these different elements. Because that's where you find the patterns. That's where you start to figure out where the problems are and where the opportunities are.
Great. I'm curious around this second question here around banks. Is there going to be a responsibility of banks, like we do in the AML framework, to report on suspicious activity? Do you envision seeing that type of reporting framework coming out as we view our customers and report on if there's additional regulatory requirements, or are we still decades away from that?
So I don't think so. And again, if you go back to my comment just a minute ago, I think most banks are approaching this, and certainly regulators are approaching this as risk and risk assessment. So in the same way that if you are a bank and you're taking credit risk or financial risk assessment, what that's doing is highlighting risks for you. It's not then your responsibility to go and report that activity. You simply use that to make an informed decision in whatever process you're incorporating that ESG assessment into, whether it's assessing finance application or whatever. So I think if ESG reporting, monitoring and reporting goes down the same trajectory, I think it'll be just part of that information risk matrix that helps banks to make informed decisions rather than looking at some kind of reporting mechanism for violators.
So using the loan analogy, like that, the more riskier types of transactions just won't get funding and they won't take off. The dirtier manufacturing and other things, they just won't get the same kind of funding or access to capital.
That's a really interesting point and actually quite a contentious point. And part of the work that we do with that working group of 70 banks is how to use that risk assessment. Because if you get to a place where a poor assessment leads to a supplier not getting finance, you are potentially costing that company quite a bit of business and therefore putting at risk jobs and employment, which is counterintuitive to the whole ESG model. So actually, there is a school of thought that suggests that as part of this risk assessment, once you've highlighted the risks, and again, it's back to Marissa's point earlier on about working with SMEs to help them understand their obligations, if you can work with that business to help them to understand how to improve their performance against those ESG metrics, then that is a better outcome for everybody, because ultimately, the purpose of monitoring and assessment has to be to improve. Otherwise, why do it at all? Otherwise, it's just reporting and assessment for the sake of reporting and assessment. So if the emphasis and if the aim of this and the ambition is to help businesses to improve their performance against ESG metrics, then you don't want to get to a situation where companies are penalized for being a risky business. For example, a coal mine is a coal mine is a coal mine. It can't do anything about that. That's what it does. By most ESG metrics, it will perform relatively poorly. But you can't not use a coal mine where coal is the fuel that you need to use. So it's then how do you help that coal mine to work within its policies, procedures, its operating practices to improve its impact against ESG. And much of that's not even, as we said before, environmental. Some of that's around its social contribution and some of its governance policies as well. So I think the aim can't be to penalise companies that don't necessarily perform well. Again, it depends on where they fall down, but it should be to help educate and help those companies to improve.
Okay. Curious to hear your guys' thoughts on the first question around the danger of overreacting in our focus on ESG and the extent that banks will be excluding politically disfavored industries from financial markets. Similar type of conversation around that sort of disincentive from we just may not be funding dirty industries. But is there a risk of overreaction? Erik, let's start with you.
I think, we are much more interconnected than people like to think we are. So globally, you have to ultimately comply with where you're trading. And to the degree that you want to make yourself uncompetitive, that's a problem. But I think we are going to see more of a harmonization of those standards that fix that in the long term. In the short term, there will maybe be some hiccups, but I think that's your bailiwick too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's back to what I was just saying. If you get to a place where industries are shut out from receiving the support that they need, then this whole process hasn't worked. But I don't think that's where the regulators are going. I don't think it's where the industry is trying to get to either. So I think the risk of that is relatively low at the moment. But as with most of these things, it'll be regulatory driven.
And I think that, I'm going to say it again, it's sounding like a broken record, transition, right? So this is where it's about the will of both the banks and our customers to get there. So I think that, exactly to your point, I don't get the sense that regulators are saying you have to be there tomorrow. But equally, as an industry, should we be working with organizations that have no interest in getting there? That's a different question, right? And I think this also comes down to, if you think about it from, one of the things I think, going back to originally to your question around transaction bankers, is that what we see is that people want to come and work for us because we have the right ESG policies, because we're trying to do something. I think particularly in trade finance, it's a marketing thing for us in terms of getting new talent, and that they can see they're really doing something tangible in terms of ESG. So I think that the risk of not moving towards this is actually quite detrimental for all of us as an industry, but also for those customers as a whole. So I think a lot of the overcorrection element too is something that perhaps we're seeing from a media perspective, but in terms of the day-to-day of what we're doing as institutions, and each of us have different risk appetites as to what we will and won't do going forward, be that around clean energy or other elements. But the intention is not to cut people out, but it's to support that transition and also understand where they are in terms of their thinking.
I think, just to follow up on that very, very quickly, if you look at the way that the regulators are setting their frameworks, it's all about what to report, not how to perform. And I think that is with that point in mind, making sure that nobody gets penalized because they're in a certain industry.
Yeah, to be honest though, I kind of disagree on that one, because I do think that there should be, going back to the solar panel subsidies that exist, it's a subsidized industry, heavily subsidized industry in order to maintain competitiveness. And subsidizing capital costs is another way to perform those subsidies, and so pushing those out. Is the risk of greenwashing through that, is it not objective and measurable enough where you could go and tackle some of those risks to try and make it more financially incentive for them?
No, I think it's a good question. So I think there's two parts to the answer to that, Chris. Part, again, is that regulatory drive to make sure that, or certainly in the EU, but the EU has been a forerunner and a front runner on ESG assessment. And again, they've made their opinion quite clear that they frown upon incentivization because it tends to lead to greenwashing. But where it can be measured, where it can be assessed, and particularly where it be quantified, so it's less subjective, it's back to that point of how can we work with those businesses and those industries to help them to improve the performance? Because that's what ESG monitoring assessment has to be about. It has to be about helping those industries that do perform badly because they have certain processes, manufacturing processes, for example, or certain raw materials. So how do we help them to minimize their impact on the environment, or make sure that they've got good coverage of S and G because their supply chains are in countries that are risky to do business with, for example. So I think where you can quantify it, it's about helping to improve rather than shutting out.
Okay. Turning again to the Q&A, in the participation in the Global Legal Entity Identifier Initiative, an option to democratize information on SMEs and their ESG footprint?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, is the quick answer. I mean, again, we're a data aggregator. We actually take data on from the GLEIF as one of those parts of data. The data is king in this world. The more data you can get and the more independent and verifiable data that you can get, then the more accurate the information is on your ESG assessment. One of the challenges you have at the moment is many of the ESG assessment methodologies are driven by self-reporting. Companies answering surveys, answering questionnaires, and that's akin to marking your own homework. And if there's an incentive or if there's a positive outcome required, more often than not, human nature says you will give yourself the benefit of the doubt when you're answering these questions. Having independent data sets that captures much of that information and where it can be verified, such as the GLEIF, that's the real key to ESG assessment and making it worth something that you can stand over.
With just a few seconds left, are there any other messages that you guys want to share with the audience, or where to start? Anybody who hasn't started this yet? Where to?
Play to your strengths. Be transparent. And there's a lot of opportunities out there. I think don't let the fear of the risks overcome action.
Yeah, I think sorry, Marissa, I'd finish by saying that good sustainability practice should enhance trade and finance. It shouldn't become a barrier. And I think we're at risk of making this too burdensome on businesses at the moment. So we need to just make sure that we're working with businesses, with regulators, to make sure that sustainability assessment enhances trade and finance rather than becomes a barrier.
Yeah, and I'd just close by saying I think there's an opportunity to gain more suppliers, more transparency, and also probably more customers by engaging in this. But there's not an end game right away. You can start from that transition from wherever you're sitting and use your banks to do that.
Perfect. Erik, Ian, Marissa, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts with the audience.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.